الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين.
So I'm going to introduce Brother Mobeen Vaid, who is, do you mind if I say you were a student of mine once upon a time as well? Because he was a student of mine, but now, mashallah, he is so well known and famous that I feel awkward calling him that. But once upon a time, he did used to attend my halaqat and durus, but now, mashallah, I sit down in his lectures, mashallah, and benefit from him. Brother Mobeen Vaid has an MA in Islamic Studies from Hartford Seminary. He is a Muslim public intellectual and writer, a regular contributor to many blogs and even academic journals. His writings center on how traditional Islamic norms and frames of thinking intersect the modern Muslim world. As of late, he has focused on Islamic sexual and gender norms. Mobeen also speaks at confessional conferences, serves as an advisor to Muslim college students, and was a campus minister for the Muslim community at George Mason University. Please help me in welcoming Brother Mobeen Vaid to the stage.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursaleen Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين قال رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. So I'm actually going to begin with an observation from George Bernard Shaw, where he said that decency cannot be discussed without indecency. I say this because I've learned from past experiences that when I begin to speak about homosexuality, I tend not to offer a disclaimer, and then I see parents usher their children out of the room. And as a person, as a father myself, I recognize the sensitivity around it, and I tend to be a little more blunt about the subject. And so if people do have some sensitivities with their children, then please make the necessary arrangements, inshaAllah ta'ala. So, speaking about sexuality itself is a difficult discussion to broach, precisely for that reason. There's something within our constitution that makes us uncomfortable when that topic is broached. And I don't think that's an unhealthy thing to have. In fact, I think there's something decidedly fitri about that we think of sexuality as something that's intensely private. It's something that exists within our homes. And certainly, talking about the subject, especially in the masjid, can make that general discomfort a lot worse. But these are difficult times that we find ourselves in. And it's important for us to speak with a sense of plainness about sexual indecency and transgression. And whereas people with deep moral commitments in this space, we have found ourselves. And I'm going to begin with something that I think other people have alluded to, but not really addressed directly, which is the concept of homosexuality and what it is. I find that often Muslims speak around the subject, or perhaps they speak of it in a way that already presupposes all of the rhetoric and language and concepts that are on offer in the public square. And so I think we have to understand that concept deeply before we can have a coherent vision of what we're supposed to do about it and how we can address it as a community. Sheikh Yasser began today and he spoke about the distinction between acts and desires. And that's an important distinction. He said that we're accountable for the acts that we carry out, not for the desires that we internally experience. And in fact, resisting those desires is a meritorious act, something that a person can get ajr and thawab for. When a person resists their shahawat, their lowly desires. And that distinction itself is important, but it doesn't fully explain homosexuality. It just doesn't. How it functions today or why it's an issue. And where I'm going to begin with this is really a discussion of identities. And it may come as a surprise here, but historically the very concept of homosexuality and heterosexuality did not exist. Those two concepts as coherent, tightly bound categories of human beings, such that a person would identify themselves as gay or straight, was not the way that human beings used to think of themselves. We think of this as a trans-historical phenomenon, that human beings have always assumed this type of thinking about who they are, but in fact, these are both very, very recent terms. In fact, we're looking at the late 19th century. Han Blank writes in a decent book, she's a progressive feminist, she writes in her surprisingly short history of heterosexuality, it has, in point of actual fact, only been possible to be a heterosexual since 1869. And this process of developing the term is something that Ned Katz calls the invention of heterosexuality. Now, this isn't to say that men and women didn't get married, didn't have children, didn't have sex. But if you went around and spoke to people and you asked them, are you straight or gay, they would not know how to comprehend that term or the question itself. It also goes without saying that some people had sex with the same sex. But if you asked them their orientation, if you asked them if they were gay, they would all probably be pretty confused by the question. And this is because people had a different conception of what their identity was and how they identified themselves. The idea that they would identify themselves on the basis of who they wanted to have sex with or were having sex with never really occurred to them. And in fact, Islamic terminology in our own tradition that we bring into this discussion do not easily or neatly map into the categories or onto the categories of homosexuality or heterosexuality. And that's why when you see scholars discuss sexual acts, they talk about the acts themselves. So when they talk about liwat, they're talking about sodomy, the sodomizer, the person who engages in sodomy. They talk about ma'boon, the passive recipient of sodomy. Right? Sihaq, which is a homosexual act between women, where you have vaginal rubbing. These are the terms that you'll find in books of fiqh. We're talking about discrete sexual acts that people took on, but not an identity formed around it. And so to give you an example of this, zina, fornication, right? So fornication is a sexual act. When we talk about someone who is a fornicator, we're talking about acts that that person does. We're not talking about their identity. You wouldn't run into someone and say that my identity is that I'm a zani because I desire having zina. Or the thought of zina comes into my mind quite a bit. That thought would have been quite strange to propose to somebody at that time. In the modern world, however, the sexual identity is perhaps the most cherished identity that a person has. It is the core of our being. It is who we are. But it's not just that. In the world of homosexuality, it tells those who adopt the identity of gay and lesbian how to live, how to think about social and cultural causes, where to hang out and socialize, where their politics should be, and how they should think about other aspects of their life, especially religion. Especially religion. What's good religion? What's bad religion? My identity as a member of a civic community tells me what I should think about that topic. And the power of this identity is such that it provides a person a comprehensive form of belonging. And I'll say, especially for us in a society where people are very alienated and isolated. They feel socially alone. They're not connected to other human beings. So much of their life is spent on their phone or online. The opportunity to belong is extremely attractive. And for people who feel ostracized by default because of things they're feeling, it offers a type of membership that can be very forceful. Coming out of the closet is therefore more than just telling one who is sexually attracted to. It's more than just me expressing to people, hey, this is who I'm sexually attracted to. It is that, of course, but it's also about telling other people who you are. It's my authentic self. Right? People speak in very sort of first-person terms these days. I want to be true to who I am. The desire for authenticity, for genuineness. People express these types of terms quite a bit today. So when we come to speak to someone who has assumed the identity of gay or lesbian and tell them that same-sex acts are haram, even while taking into account the distinction between acts and desires, what we are in effect telling them, and this is how many of them process this, is at the core of their very selves, and how they've come to understand themselves is false. Their identity, their community, their thinking about the world, how they dress, who they hang out with, and everything in between is entirely invalid. And all of those things are interconnected to their sexual desires and their acts that come from that. And so those are sort of the seed from which this entire infrastructure grows. And so it's essential for us to realize the power of an identity. Right? Sheikh Umar spoke about conservative and how he doesn't like conservative as an adjectival for Muslim. Right? Conservative Muslim. What does it mean to be a conservative Muslim? We should reject that. When people say, oh, you're just a conservative Muslim because what? Because I believe that liwat is haram, because I believe same-sex acts are haram, that's Islam. Right? We don't take on those types of adjectives when we're describing normative Muslim position. And likewise, when it comes to this identity, and this identity is a very powerful identity, and we have to try to develop our own language. We must show people who are struggling with same-sex acts that their actual identity is not drawn from who they want to have sex with or who they feel sexually attracted to, but is in fact a function of their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As Muslims, there is no identity more critical to us in our lives than being Muslim. Being Muslim gives us identity. Man ahsanu qawlan mimman da'a ila Allah wa amila saliha wa qala innani min al-muslimin. Who is better in speech than the one who calls to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and does good works and says, I am from the Muslims. We all have other identities in our lives. We're parents, we're siblings, we're children, we're students, we're teachers. We are a variety of other things in our lives, but all of those identities are conditioned and qualified by Islam, not the other way around. And I'm going to quote Dr. Sherman Jackson here. He's a scholar of Islam and race relations. He's written a lot on the subject, and I think he expressed this priority very beautifully in a piece he authored on politics. And he said, I want to declare that my ultimate commitment is to God and the religion of Islam, and that Islam shall sit in judgment over my racial identity, not the other way around. Thus, even as I pursue the well-being of the broader Black American collective, I shall commit to doing so on the basis of the values, virtues, and priorities of Islam. My blackness is neither a morality, nor a statement of ultimate truth, nor a path to otherworldly salvation. Islam, on the other hand, is all of these for me. For people who have been conditioned and really indoctrinated in some ways into viewing themselves as gay or lesbian, overcoming that identity hurdle can be very, very difficult. But once overcome, it can actually be very liberating. It can usher in a world of gratitude and piety and a life comported to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why we have to resist the temptation of these identities. You know, when I deal with college students, if a college student comes to me and he confides in me and he says, you know, I'm struggling with same-sex acts, or he says, hey, often it's more, I think I'm gay, right? Or I think I'm lesbian. The first thing I'll mention to them is that you don't need to pigeonhole yourself that way, right? You don't need to carry the baggage of that identity. You're Muslim first. We all have desires that if we acted on them are haram. Join the club. Especially on college campuses, everyone has sexual desires that if they act on them are haram. And in that environment, it's very difficult in that atmosphere to resist it. And so you're just one of us. And if you maintain your commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is reward at the end of the tunnel there. And so that's an important piece of this. And it's also to reinforce the idea that their entire life is still open to them. There's opportunities in front of them to find a life and to find the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in front of them. This also importantly means that we ourselves should stop using these terms and categories. When we speak of gay Muslims or lesbian Muslims, we are in fact making this problem worse. We're reinscribing that identity in individuals. We're conflating too much, right? Everything that identity incorporates or conglomerates alongside the actual desires and acts themselves. We are also beginning from the default premise that those who carry that identity are in fact a distinct civic community, one that is predicated on the identity of sexual desires. In this, being gay or lesbian is the political, social, and moral equivalent of being black, Irish, or female. And thus we begin to think about this problem in those exact same terms. When you see people talking about the church, for instance, the question used to be, what does the church think about homosexuality? Now the question is, what's the church's position on LGBT people? Because now you're talking about a community, and so suddenly the discussion has shifted into a civil rights struggle. Civil rights becomes the natural paradigm to think about this issue within. Because the moral question has been dissembled in some ways. It's been tossed into the mix of that identity. And it's put people in a position wherein their own discomfort, their own opposition morally, is suddenly bigotry and hatred. And to move away from that in a conversation where we're talking about civil rights is exceedingly difficult. Because the terms of the discussion have been set. And when those terms are already foregrounded, you're invariably in a losing discussion. It's very difficult to overcome that. And so I want to start from that. And I say this, and I'll say it frankly, if we don't understand how identities fit into this conversation, we don't understand homosexuality, period. We just don't understand the topic itself. Now from here, I want to transition into the political question. And I will discuss this topic in a way that is perhaps a little more strident than those who came before me. But I want to discuss how we can be moral citizens in the world. And I say this knowing that a lot of people believe the answer to be obvious, partly because we have a lot of confidence in our own moral intuitions. And we think that if we found ourselves confronted with injustice and tyranny, that we would recognize it immediately. And that once recognizing it, we would oppose it. You know, when I talk to students, one of the things I talk to them about is history. And I ask them questions about different historical moments, and I say, what would you do if you were living at that time? And I tend to find that students are very confident in their moral sensibilities. So I ask them, if you were living in the 1940s in Germany, what would you think about Nazism if you were not a Jew? If you were living in the 18th century in America and you saw chattel slavery in front of you, what would you think about slavery? Right? And of course, those are civilizational catastrophes, right? But history is filled with registers of really, really bad accidents, right? Not accidents, but very, very bad acts, I should say, right? You have many, many instances in history where you had tyranny, oppression, and injustice that proliferated at different points. Many societies, for instance, carried out human sacrifices. Pedophilia was very popular in some societies. Child killing, the Quraysh, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about this. بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. For what sin was the young girl killed? Because they used to kill their daughters. This was a very common practice. And we look at this with horror, not realizing that many societies actually did this type of stuff. Especially if you read history, it's not uncommon at all. Some committed acts of genocide, some deified human beings. Some of those human beings were wretched, some of them were decent human beings. Again, there's a lot of wrong that was done. And the point I try to make in highlighting this is simply this point. It's very difficult for a person to discern right and wrong when they're living in a moment where wrong is publicly accepted. And when that wrong is accepted as the social norm. And when there is virtue and value attached to that wrong. Because what happens is you get socialized into seeing something a certain way. And your own sensibilities, your attitude about what's right, your moral conditioning changes. And from that point forward, everything else follows. If we were living just 20 years ago, as many of us were, how would any of us think about homosexuality, the act itself? How would we think about alliance forming, for instance? What would we think about whether or not it's prudent to advocate on its behalf? I suspect that most of us would have been deeply uncomfortable with that very discussion. We'd probably ask where this is coming from, or why that's even a relevant discussion. Now, the common retort to this would be to say, well, just back then we were all a bunch of bigots, and we've become enlightened since then. But then again, how can we be so sure? Right? In all of the examples that I gave, if you look at history, you look at the chronology of it, injustice was always preceded by eras in which that injustice didn't exist. There were moments where it was absent and suddenly it materialized and manifested, such that injustice became the natural order of the world, and past attitudes on those things became illegitimate. And I make this point when I talk about politics because absent revelation, there would be lots of reason to see this question as difficult, and it would be very tough to arrive at anything approaching decisive conclusions. But I don't think, alhamdulillah, that's not the situation that we're in. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is quite clear in stating the sinfulness of same-sex acts and other sexual transgressions more broadly. The people of Lut alayhi salam were destroyed for this. And mind you that in the Quran, Allah mentions but a few societies that were destroyed for different acts and crimes that they committed and transgressions that they carried out. The people of Lut alayhi salam carried out other sins as well, yes. They were guilty of highway robbery, for instance, among other things. But their emblematic crime, their emblematic sin, the one that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions more than once, is that the men took for sexual interest and acts other men instead of women. أَإِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ الرِّجَالَ شَهْوَةً مِّن دُونِ النِّسَاءِ. That you approach men lustfully instead of women. That is the repeated mention in the Quran itself. Beyond that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about the seriousness of sexual chastity. Even zina, to use a modern term, is a high crime in the Sharia. So sexual ethics are a matter of huge import in Islam. And I should say that sexual ethics are a matter of huge import in societies at large. There's hardly a civilization except that they have rules that govern how sex takes place, and in which context it's licit and illicit, and what goes too far and what doesn't go too far. Every society has standards surrounding this question, because sex sits at the heart of society. Procreation, right? The reproduction of life, families, bringing new life into this world. This is all involved with the question of sex and sexuality. And so when societies like ours soften on things viewed as morally reprehensible not long ago, they praise them, destigmatize them, and insist that any objection to them is just old world taboo, then we should realize we're in very dangerous ground. Or we're on very dangerous ground, rather. And this is very important because we're often told that gay marriage, for example, doesn't harm anyone else, and that the implications of it are such that it has no bearing on our immediate lives. But it in fact does. It really does. Redefining marriage, for example, requires us to abandon the core definition of marriage and what marriage has always been about. The family which emerges through the specifically organic act of sex between a man and a wife. And on a side, this is why from the maqasid of the Sharia is the notion of nasl, right? Lineage, the preservation of it, or nasab. In favor of marriage that is now defined through personal agreement, romance, and a lifestyle decision. When conceived of this way, marriage becomes vulnerable. The thought of getting married today is actually not incredibly attractive as an option, and it should not come as a surprise in this newfangled interpretation of marriage that we are now witnessing fewer marriages, fewer children, and fewer families coming into the world. And this is a phenomenon that's taking place throughout the West. In fact, reproduction rates right now in the United States, I want to say, are very close to where it was, if it's not lower than where they were back in 1984. So, again, the erosion of values. It opens the door to reconceptualizing sexual ethics across the board. What is moral and immoral is a basic matter of personal consent today, nothing more. Pornography becomes normalized and burgeons. But objecting to it is bigotry and irrational taboo because it's all consenting adults. Calls to legalize sex work now make the same argument. Laws against prostitution restrict a woman's agency to transact of her own body. Almost all of the leading, or in fact, a number of the leading Democratic presidential candidates are in favor of legalizing sex work, which is a euphemism for prostitution. And this problem is not limited to marriage, sex work, or pornography. There's hardly any secular justification to restrictions on gambling at all. For example, abortion now is something that can be pursued entirely electively up till birth. So we also have the problem of infanticide and baby killing, which is a real issue. And it's sad, it's very sad that many Muslims are unmoved by this subject and are actually okay with it taking place in an entirely elective capacity, so long as the woman, in fact, always maintains her right to choose. Again, we find our morals collapsing in the face of a society that makes the actual wrongdoing seem normal and actually virtuous. And so the wrong is now, in fact, the opposition of it. I'll mention a couple of examples here just to get across just how complicated this type of moral schema can be. The first I'll mention is Thomas Zass. Thomas Zass is a late psychologist, heavy-handed critic, in fact, of psychology, perhaps the most strident internal critic of psychology itself. He wrote a book called Suicide Prohibition, The Shame of Medicine. And he argued that suicide is a fundamental human right, and that the cruelty comes in trying to prevent it. That's where cruelty begins. And he sees social limits and efforts to stop people as coercion and tyranny. We live in a free society, he argued. And he said that this is simply a new world religion being carried out through the acts of the government and the psychotherapeutic industry. Peter Singer is a philosopher, and I believe he's at Princeton. And he writes in some of his moral dissertations about when a life becomes a life. And he asked the question, why do we assume a life becomes a life at birth? He said, what makes a 1 week or 2 week old baby alive? He says, did that baby know of its own life? Can that baby talk? Can that baby actually tell us? Can that baby recognize its own name? What makes that baby's life more meaningful than a baby that's 9 months old in the womb? And he says we were too harsh in our rush to judgment over infanticide in past societies. That was our problem. And I assure you that this is not rhetorical or cynical or trying to highlight the problems of abortion. He's simply saying, look, what makes us so confident that we know when life begins? Because that's a metaphysical question. And your assumption that this baby has a life, in his opinion, is unfounded. Again, all of these things are difficult things to argue back when you're simply dealing with secular debates, particularly if we accept the grounds of these discussions which have already been provided to us in modern society. In fact, there's a lot of material today that would exist in their favor. And this is in reality what the normalization of homosexuality requires of us. It asks us to abandon our anthropology of human beings. It asks us to deny the purpose of sex, to redefine what family means, to look at procreation as a biological coincidence, and to not only turn a blind eye, but to actually endorse open fahisha and fasad. Transgenderism takes this further and asks us to literally deny what it means to be a man or a woman. A lot of our discussion today has focused on the legal limits and legislation and what we can do as a community to protect the integrity of our community. But the vast majority of this discussion cannot be legislated. We cannot legislate against television. Sheikh Yasser spoke about GLAAD and the percentages that they're guiding towards. We can't opt out. I mean, we can opt out, but the vast majority of people probably won't. Netflix, Disney+, Apple TV, and Hulu. Every major city in this country has pride rallies, a gay district. Pride Month is far more visible than Black History Month. And I don't even think there's a debate on that anymore. A recent study found that amongst millennials today, over 50% of millennials do not identify as straight. Identifying as straight is now a minority amongst millennials. And the younger you go, the more disproportionate it becomes. There is a rapid growth and rapid rise in childhood transgenderism. And this is very scary. Wallahi, this is very scary. Where you talk about the medicalizing of children and how the discrimination framework is being used against physicians and against parents to force this into schools, libraries, and the medical community and psychotherapists as a whole. As people of religion, how can we buck this trend and how can we push back? Mary Eberstadt, who I believe is an excellent figure for many of us to read. She has a great book, recent book, Primal Screams. I would highly recommend it. In fact, her lectures themselves are quite good as well. But she has argued previously about the close relationship between a strong family life and a strong religious life. As Muslims, this relationship should come to us, obviously. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala pairs tawheed and being good to one's parents. وَقَضَى رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. That your Lord has decreed that you worship none but Allah and that you do good to your parents. And this also means, and I'm going to be blunt here, that as a community, we have to stop promoting people who themselves make a hallmark of their activities LGBT advocacy. When we look at the rates at which this issue is changing and how quickly youth are being confused on topics like this, what type of message does that send? We have prominent Muslim actors who have made LGBT advocacy central to their politics. These people are lionized in Muslim settings, presented to our children as heroes and icons to revere and to look up to. This drastically worsens the situation. If we're concerned about legislation and the government restricting our ability to live as faithful Muslims, then we should have some measure of concern over those in our own ranks whose efforts to serve to teach our youth that LGBT is something to be celebrated. There's a lot more that I could say, and I have a minute, so I will conclude. And in this conclusion, I'm going to make one simple point. We speak a lot about pluralism and recognizing the fact that all of society is not going to be Muslim. And that goes without saying. Patrick Deneen and a number of other writers have written about this, so this is not my original thought. In fact, Jonathan Rawls, he had a famous piece on the overlapping consensus. But the idea here is very simple. For pluralism to exist, there has to be some basic core issues that society can come to agreement about. And pluralism functions off of the base agreement that society has come to on the big and core, simple, elemental issues of life. If we can no longer agree about what it means to be a man or a woman, if we can no longer agree about what it means to be a family, then we should not be surprised that our social situation and our political situation are rapidly deteriorating. Nor should we be surprised about how caustic and hostile everything's getting on the outside and on the inside. In closing, I'm reminded the 1966 film, A Man for All Seasons. Has anyone seen that? Probably not, it's an old film. In any event, the film tells of King Henry VII, who wished to have his marriage annulled and to remarry as his current wife had not produced a male heir. In the film, Thomas More, who was the Lord Chancellor of England, he was pursued and chastised for refusing to apply pressure on the Church and Pope to grant Henry's divorce. And this is the quote that I'll close with, where in response to this pressure, Thomas More says something important and I think worth remembering. He says, "When statesmen forsake their own private conscience for the sake of their own public duties, they lead their country by a short route to chaos." May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us thabat in our lives and may He guide us in these difficult times. And we have salah right now. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Salamun ala al-mursalin. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Allahumma musta'an.
إن المسلمين والمسلمات والمؤمنين والمؤمنات والقانتين والقانتات والصادقين والصادقات والصابرين والصابرات والخاشعين والخاشعات والمتصدقين والمتصدقات والصائمين والصائمات والحافظين فروجهم والحافظات والذاكرين الله كثيرا والذاكرات أعد الله لهم مغفرة وأجرا عظيما.